Welcome to Free Kiwis. We're delighted today to welcome Toby Young as our guest. Now, Toby is visiting New Zealand with the New Zealand Free Speech Union. He is himself the founder of the Free Speech Union in the United Kingdom, the associate editor of the Spectator, and a former editor of Quillette. So welcome to Free Kiwis, Toby.
Thank you.
Interesting point to start with regarding the UK Free Speech Union. My co-host James and I were both very early members of it. This was before the New Zealand Free Speech Union existed, and the fact that there was a Free Speech Union somewhere in the world was enough for us to join up.
Well, thank you for being early adopters.
So what led you to start the Free Speech Union in the UK?
I think it was a number of things. One was attending an academic conference organised by Nigel Biggar, then a professor at Oxford, of cancelled academics and various people who'd got into difficulty and been targeted for cancellation by outrage mobs like Amy Wax at Pennsylvania Law School attended this meeting, and Douglas Murray was there and a few other people in this kind of firmament. And it became clear at the conclusion of that meeting that we really needed to set up an organisation. And at that stage, we were thinking about an organisation that would primarily defend academics targeted for cancellation. And Neil Ferguson at that point had talked about creating a kind of NATO of the pen, which was very much that idea. And Nigel Biggar, who chaired it, who'd arranged this event, agreed to be the chair, and Douglas Murray agreed to be one of the directors. But when I sort of started thinking about it in more detail, I thought, well, why restrict it to academics? Why not extend it to anyone who earns their living by talking about ideas? And then I thought, well, why restrict it to them? Let's just make it anyone can join. But it was also because I was cancelled myself in 2018. So I was appointed to this new higher education regulator in England by the then Prime Minister Theresa May, because it was a public body. And it was a kind of nothing burger of a job. I was one of 15 non-executive directors. We were going to meet maybe 4 times a year. But The Guardian got it into its head that I had a much more important role than I really did. And it sort of broke the news with Toby Young to be Theresa May's new university's czar, which was, a wild exaggeration of my role. But that was a kind of gold-embossed invitation to offence archaeologists to trawl through everything I'd said or written dating back more than 30 years to try and find things to be offended and upset by. Because I'd been a controversial, provocative journalist for my entire career, it didn't take them long to discover a Tutankhamun's tomb's worth of material to be offended by. And they started kind of producing this stuff mainly on Twitter, as it then was. And
I was going to say, presumably they found a few ill-advised tweets to
and a few ill-advised tweets. I mean, one of the things they found was so they started going through the Spectator's digital archive dating back to 1822, and I remember my boss Fraser Nelson telling me that the 10 most searched for articles in this archive were all articles by me, and it was offence archaeologists looking for stuff they could flag up as proof that I wasn't a suitable person to be Theresa May's university's czar. And someone found an article from 2000, and the headline on the piece was "Confessions of a Porn Addict," which was a slightly misleading headline. I don't want to protest too much, but it was a mischievous headline written by the then sub-editor, who wasn't a huge fan of mine. And someone found this, screenshot it, put it on Twitter, and then 2 hours later, the Evening Standard, London's biggest selling newspaper, ran with the headline, "Theresa May's new university czar confesses to being porn addict." Then the Times reproduced it the following day, and then there was an urgent question in Parliament in which one kind of pious Labour shadow minister after another kind of lined up to ask the higher education minister why Theresa May had appointed a pornography addict to be her new university czar. And after kind of 8 days of being monstered like this, I decided to step down. And I apologise for some of the more sophomoric things I'd said late at night after a couple of glasses of wine on social media. And I thought naively that would draw a line under the whole affair. But actually that was like throwing a chunk of raw beef to a shoal of piranha fish. And they inevitably came for me in all my other positions, and I ended up losing 5 positions in total. I lost a stone in weight while this was all going on. I described it as the public humiliation diet. And when the kind of dust had settled, I thought what I really needed when that was happening to me when my career was burning to the ground, was an organisation that could advise me how best to respond when you're at the eye of one of these kind of Twitter storms. You know, should I get out there and defend myself on the airwaves, or should I lie doggo on the assumption that, you know, less said, soonest mended? Should I apologise? Will that make things worse? Can you put me in touch with anyone who's been through something similar? And there was no organisation like that out there. So when I'd recovered from being cancelled myself, I decided to set up that organisation. And so it was really those two things that led to the creation of the Free Speech Union in the UK.
On the apologies question, it seems fairly obvious that one should never apologise. As you said, it's raw meat to a beast.
Yes, I mean...
it's a hallmark of cancel culture, isn't it? Because in the past, that was the dumb thing. If you'd said something a bit ill-advised, you'd front up and apologise, and generally speaking, your apology would be widely accepted. You may step down from something, and that would draw a line under it. But with this new virulent cancel culture approach, it seems to be just make everything worse. It's an admission of guilt, and there's no redemption possible.
Yes, I mean, I think people imagine that there are these similarities between, you know, the woke religion and the old Christian religion, and that it has enough in common that there is a possibility of, you know, atonement, a plea for forgiveness, redemption, readmission. But in the woke church, there is no such mechanism. And so generally apologising just makes things worse. You're effectively abasing yourself at the feet of the mob, pleading for mercy, and they just see that as a sign of weakness. But I think fundamentally they just regard what you've said as so beyond the pale that you should just be excommunicated, pushed out, and there's really no room for you in polite society any longer. So, yeah, we generally advise people, not always. I think there are some exceptional circumstances in which apologising can help, but generally, no, it makes things worse.
So with the Free Speech Union, what other kinds of cases have you been fighting? Because we often get the criticism, oh, you're talking about free speech. Well, free speech is just, you know, rich white guys' opportunity to say racist and misogynist things. So is that your only demographic, or are you fighting lots of different kinds of cases? Because it's a criticism that we often get.
Yeah, no, so that's a criticism that's been levelled at the FSU in the UK. It's been quite helpful that one of the earliest cases we took on was that of Selina Todd, Professor of Modern History at Oxford. She was no-platformed from a feminist conference at, I think, Exeter College at Oxford, and she'd helped organise this conference and is a fairly prominent feminist and historian of the feminist movement. And we took up the cudgels on her behalf, and we managed to get the college to apologise and review its kind of procedures so something like that wouldn't happen again. And that sent a message to the kind of gender-critical feminist community that there was this organisation out there that would stick up for them. And so we've spent an enormous amount of time defending GC feminists who've got into trouble at universities, in the workplace, in their professional associations, you know, sports clubs. And so if you look at we've taken on about 2,500 plus cases in the past 4 and a bit years since the FSU was set up in 2020. And 40% of those cases are coded sex and gender in our case files. It's by far the largest single category. And nearly all of them are gender-critical feminists.
Well, the UK's been ground zero for that issue in many ways, with the Tavistock Clinic and now the report that was looking into the way the whole issue's been handled. Do you think the FSU there has been a game changer for that issue in the UK?
I think it's helped. I mean, there's been a kind of this sort of unusual alliance between Tories and TERFs fighting back against, you know, this rather narrow, radical progressive ideology. And I think it's really helped disabuse people of the idea that free speech is really only something that, you know, male, pale and stale conservatives should be concerned about. Now, it doesn't always help in rebutting the smear that free speech is a right-wing cause, because many of these gender-critical feminists, even though they're on the left and have been on the left their entire lives, are coded now as far right by the radical progressive left. People like, you know, Kelly J. Keane, for instance, described as a Nazi because of her gender-critical beliefs. But I think for more reasonable people who aren't kind of part of the cult, it does make it clear that it isn't just, you know, people like me who need to be worried about free speech.
One of the things I've noticed with the New Zealand Free Speech Union is that as time has gone on and different issues have come up, there's a kind of influx of people based on, well, whether it's gender critical feminists or COVID lockdown skeptics or people who are opposed to treaty co-governance in New Zealand. These people come on board, but quite often they're one-issue wonders in a way and don't necessarily have the sticking power with free speech as the central issue. Have you found that as well, that people can be a bit fickle when it comes to free speech, that they have a particular issue that they care about and want to see free speech for that, but then something else comes along that they don't like as much and not so much with free speech for that?
Yes, I mean, I think it's inevitable that people will be more exercised about sticking up for their right to say what it is they want to say about one of these controversial issues, and less concerned about sticking up for the right of people whom they profoundly disagree with. But interestingly, many of the GC feminists that we've worked with at the FSU have said that they've effectively been red-pilled by being targeted by outrage mobs themselves, and are apologetic in some cases for not defending the free speech of their political enemies in the past. Graham Linehan, another good example, someone we've defended, was on a speaking tour here recently with the New Zealand Free Speech Union. He was not quite a leader, but a kind of he would kind of put himself at the head of various outrage mobs, 10 years ago, and actually targeted me at one stage when I was writing a column for The Sun on Sunday, a sort of right-of-centre British tabloid, and is now kind of, I think, deeply apologetic about having kind of been a kind of censor in the past, now that he's himself been targeted. But I think it's, it's a journey that many people who see themselves as being on the left and who weren't worried about free speech until fairly recently, now that they've kind of parted company with some of their colleagues and been targeted themselves. I think it's a journey that many of them... You could say the same with people on the right. I mean, until... 15 years ago, it was mainly the right doing the cancelling. So they've been on a journey too.
Yes, indeed.
We should probably talk a little bit about academic freedom, because we're actually writing a report on academic freedom in New Zealand right at the moment. So I'm interested, could you talk a little bit about this new bill that's going to come into force very soon in the UK, the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill? Because I understand the Free Speech Union in the UK has been quite active in supporting that bill.
Yes. Yeah, that's probably our biggest legislative triumph to date. I mean, we're not solely responsible for it. We've been part of a kind of coalition of groups petitioning the UK government to do more to protect free speech and academic freedom on campus. And there was a line in the Conservative Manifesto in 2019 effectively saying that if universities don't get their own house in order, the government would intervene to insist that they do when it comes to protecting free speech and academic freedom. And so over the past 5 years, we, along with some other groups, have been instrumental in drafting this legislation, amending it, protecting it, getting it through the two houses of Parliament. And it actually received royal assent last year, but the Act hasn't been fully activated yet. It's not due to be activated until August the 1st. And so naturally we were concerned that it might be torpedoed by the snap election if as seems overwhelmingly likely, Labour win. But actually the statutory instrument to activate the various clauses was laid before Parliament was dissolved. And so unless Labour make an effort to overturn that in the sort of 3 weeks after being elected, before all the clauses are due to be activated on August 1st, it will be activated. And I don't think they will. I think it will be activated. And what it does is it creates slightly more robust protections for free speech and academic freedom at English universities. Only applies to English universities because education is a devolved area of administration in the UK. And academic freedom, free speech on campus was already protected by an Education Act passed in 1986. So this slightly improves on that. So universities now no longer just have a legal duty to uphold free speech, they also have a legal duty to promote free speech on campus. So a slightly more onerous obligation than they already had. But perhaps more importantly, the 86 Act was more honoured in the breach than the observance. So, all universities generally have free speech policies. That's true of most universities, all universities in the UK. But there are often, competing rights, competing considerations, which mean that they don't observe their own free speech policies, and it's very hard, has been hard until now, to hold their feet to the fire. But the Act creates two enforcement mechanisms. One is it's created this new free speech czar at the Office for Students, who you can complain to if you're a student or on faculty or a visiting speaker and you think your speech rights have been breached by the university. It hasn't done enough to uphold and promote free speech in your case. You can complain to the new free speech czar, and he can impose fines on universities if he upholds your complaint. And in addition, it's created a new tort whereby you can sue universities if you think they've breached your right to free speech, haven't discharged their duties properly. And so we hope that with those two enforcement mechanisms and these slightly more robust duties, that free speech and academic freedom will be better protected henceforth at English universities. And it would be great if a similar piece of legislation could be passed here.
Strikingly similar situations are in New Zealand, because also in New Zealand, the Education Act, also called the Education Act, basically says very clearly students and academics have the right to put forward, I think it says, voice unpopular opinions.
Controversial views.
Controversial views, that's right. And yet, it's, as you say, in New Zealand as well, it's been honoured more in the breach than in the observance. So, I mean, we're recommending something with a bit more teeth in New Zealand as well. But one of the objections we get on this is the idea that if the state intervenes in universities or the state passes legislation to support free speech, that's somehow ironic, or it's some kind of paradox or contradiction.
It's a breach of academic freedom itself somehow. Which is a curious kind of argument.
Yeah. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, we've had the same objection was made when the bill was going through the House of Lords. So many people in the House of Lords are university vice-chancellors or former university vice-chancellors or heads of Oxford and Cambridge colleges, and exactly the same objection was made. This is an intrusion into the autonomy of universities. How can you protect free speech by having the state threaten universities with various penalties if they don't do more to uphold it? That, as you say, sort of paradox. I think we made a couple of arguments. One was that the outgoing Labour government in 2010 passed a piece of legislation called the Equality Act, which created various obligations on public sector bodies, including universities, to defend equality in various ways and punish them if they didn't. And British universities made absolutely no objection to that particular intrusion, that encroachment on their autonomy. So why object to this one when you didn't object to the previous one? In addition, I think our chief legal counsel made the argument that, why are you kicking up such a fuss about being asked to defend a fundamental human right?
And a fundamental duty of universities.
And a fundamental duty of university, yeah. If you're neglecting that duty, then why should you continue to receive taxpayer funding and state support in various ways if you're neglecting what should be, your core purpose, one of your core purposes? So that was kind of like, that was an argument. We also said, you won't need to worry about state intervention to ensure you discharge your new legal duties if you're properly discharging them. It's only if you're neglecting free speech, if you're not defending academic freedom, that you'll need to worry.
It seems to me there's no paradox at all. They haven't been doing what they were supposed to do, and requirements that they do so are being beefed up. It seems entirely consistent to me.
Yeah, I think there's also a fallacy in seeing free speech as some kind of substantive ideology that they're imposing on universities. I mean, if they were going to universities and saying, look, you have to teach Anglican Christianity, which, to be fair, they used to in England, right? That would be one thing. Or if they were saying you have to teach socialism or something, that would be one thing. But it's really saying that you have to make sure there's a space for people to explore different ideas, which to me is completely different.
And I suppose you could make the argument, look, if a university was discriminating against Maori students, for instance, the university or the defenders of the autonomy of universities wouldn't object if the state or the court intervened to put a stop to that discrimination. So why would you object to the state or the courts intervening to stop you discriminating against people on the basis of their lawfully held beliefs.
Especially because it strikes me we already have lots of things like the New Zealand Bill of Rights. We have law already that says that people have a right to free expression. So it's really just the state kind of backing that up and actually trying to implement it.
I must say, I think the free speech czar idea is probably essential to the success of this legislative program. I'm not sure what's being contemplated here, whether they're thinking along those lines or not, but certainly they're asking the universities to make sure they have free speech policies. Now, we've seen drafts of some of those policies, and I worry that on their own they could make things worse rather than better, because they tend to put in all sorts of loopholes about exceptions to when people should be able to say what they want on campuses, whether it's, speaking within your area of expertise, or provided you don't violate the university's values, which are nebulous things that you can easily make a case that just about any statement violates in some way, or any substantive statement. So I do think that having somebody to give it teeth is essential.
Yes, I think that's right. I think it's very difficult to be a free speech absolutist. There are always going to be competing rights, other considerations. So it doesn't matter how robust on paper universities' free speech policies are, they will always have the kind of wiggle room to not enforce them. So it is important, I think, that there are some external enforcement mechanisms, such as a free speech czar of some kind. Yeah, interesting you mentioned within your field of expertise. So that was a real controversial point of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. Initially, in the initial draft, the new, more robust protections for academic freedom would only apply to academics when speaking within their field of expertise. If they strayed beyond that, then they wouldn't be entitled to these more robust protections, wouldn't be able to complain or sue. And we got that changed. We amended the bill to ensure that it defends academics even when speaking, the protections apply even when they're speaking out with their field of expertise. And I think we quickly realised one of the difficulties, there are several difficulties with that, but one of the difficulties is that the disputes in universities, the haggling between the new free speech czar and the university that had punished an academic for saying something contentious outside his field of expertise. Well, the argument would be about, was he speaking within or out with his field of expertise? You can imagine, endless wrangling about that particular point, which is sort of really straying beyond the kind of fundamental issue at hand. And, a lot of academic fields are now multidisciplinary.
And besides which, academics are presumably reasonably smart people. That's why they're academics. They have a duty to make public comment on matters that occur to them as worthy of public comment. So why should it matter if it's in their field of expertise or not? If they get something wrong, then some expert can come along and correct them. And that's kind of the purpose of free speech.
It would seem to put sort of limitations on academic speech which are greater than the speech rights that most people have, right?
Yeah.
Which is very odd. You expect academics to have more free speech rights. If academic freedom means something, it probably should mean that they have more speech rights than the average man.
Yes.
If indeed that's possible. Ideally it wouldn't be, because anybody should.
But especially when people's jobs are targeted. There are certain jobs, I suppose, where you could make an argument. Well, it seems pretty clear, like if you're working as a marketer or something and you say your company's product is rubbish, you might get in trouble for that.
Sure.
So academics should have kind of like really souped up protection for their jobs.
In terms of criticising their employer, I think that's right. Yeah, you've said that you don't think that the presumed incoming Labor government will overturn this legislation. What do you think the prospects for free speech under a Starmer government are like more generally?
Well, I'm reasonably optimistic they won't overturn the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. I think partly because Labour's now got a problem with radical Islamic voters. There's a new Islamic lobby group called the Muslim Vote, and in some cases they're running candidates against Labour candidates in constituencies with large Muslim populations. And they're very exercised, obviously, about the Israel-Hamas conflict and about Labour's position on that conflict. And many Labour MPs have been targeted by Muslim activists and their offices vandalised and so forth. So that's a kind of burgeoning issue and will be a continuing issue for the incoming Labour government. But I think that one of the reasons they'll be reluctant to repeal this legislation is because pro-Palestinian protesters at universities, not just students but also academics, will be protected by these new protections in a way they aren't at the moment. So it would seem like another way of undermining the pro-Palestinian cause if they were to repeal this legislation, which would create bad blood with this new lobby that they're very keen to placate. So that's why I'm reasonably optimistic about that. But of course, there are lots of reasons to be pessimistic too. I know that the New Zealand Free Speech Union saw off attempts by the last government here to criminalise various forms of hate speech. And we've had a hate crime act passed in Scotland which criminalises various forms of speech which aren't currently unlawful in the rest of the UK. And I'm concerned that a Labour government will pass a Hate Crime and Public Order England and Wales Act, so essentially extending the same prohibitions that currently just apply in Scotland to England and Wales.
I see. I would have thought the Scottish experience would scare them off. I mean, it seems a total dog's breakfast.
Yeah, the Scottish experience, one would hope, would be a shot across Keir Starmer's bows. Humza Yousaf, the Scottish First Minister, as was, not anymore. I mean, he was gone, defenestrated within less than 30 days of the Scottish Hate Crime Act being activated. Now, that wasn't the main cause of his demise. It was because the coalition between the SNP and the Greens collapsed. But nevertheless, it contributed to an undermining of his authority. And he was widely ridiculed. So as soon as the Scottish Hate Crime Act was activated, it took 3 years to activate it. It got royal assent in 21, wasn't activated until April Fool's Day, of all days, this year. And as soon as it was activated, within 48 hours, more complaints had been received by Police Scotland about a speech Humza Yousaf had made in 2020 in which he complained that there were too many white people at the kind of apex of Scottish society. People, accused him of anti-white racism and urged Police Scotland to investigate him because they thought it would be an offence under the new Scottish Hate Crime Act. So, I mean, he was ridiculed. He lost a great deal of authority. J.K. Rowling kind of taunted him to, come after her for misgendering people and started misgendering trans activists left and right, and they didn't do anything, and that made him look weak. So hopefully that'll give Keir Starmer pause for thought on that issue, but I'm worried that it won't. And they've already talked about doing more to protect vulnerable groups, the LGBTQI plus community from hate speech. They probably do something to criminalise Islamophobia. So there's an all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims' definition of Islamophobia, which the Labour Party's already embraced, and it includes within this extraordinarily capacious definition any criticism of the religion of Islam. So one worry is that they'll try and embed this prohibition on Islamophobia in law, at least in England and Wales. It looks like they're going to pass a conversion therapy ban. They've said they're going to do that. I think it's in the Labour manifesto. The worry there, as I'm sure you know, is that it won't just criminalise what we commonly think of as conversion therapy, which is already against the law in the UK and largely, doesn't exist anymore, but will criminalise health professionals and parents trying to dissuade gender-confused adolescents from embarking on irreversible medical pathways.
I mean, that one strikes me as a particularly specious issue in many ways, because if somebody is an adult, who's to say that they shouldn't undergo conversion therapy if they want to? I mean, that seems to me a fundamental human right. If I want to go and talk to some religious preacher about how I don't want to be homosexual or something, that's my right. It might be misguided, but it's my right. Mm-hmm. If I'm not an adult, well, obviously I shouldn't be able to make that decision without the consent of my parents. And so why this conversion therapy ban is required is a little beyond me.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be a kind of moral panic based on extremely threadbare data that, according to the advocates of the ban, shows that these sorts of conversion practices are still widespread and vulnerable adults are being browbeaten into undergoing, cruel treatments to try and cure themselves of being gay, and actually the evidence that that's happening is virtually
Well, I mean,
non-existent.
if there's actual compulsion, then it should be criminal.
Well, if
obviously.
there's actual compulsion, then it's already
Exactly.
illegal,
So,
and
yeah.
there doesn't need to be.
So it seems like a smokescreen to protect those who think that giving teenagers hormones and surgery is a great idea, protect them from scrutiny.
Well, that seems to be where most of the pressure to pass a conversion therapy ban is coming from within the Labour Party. There is a kind of well-organised, powerful trans lobby in the party, and I'm sure that if they do pass a ban, they won't be careful enough about protecting health professionals and parents who want to have those good faith conversations with gender-confused adolescents. It will effectively force them to adopt a kind of what's called an affirmative care approach, whereby you just take the self-diagnosis of a confused child at face value and then help them kind of take steps which in many cases they'll come to regret.
Okay, let's change tack a bit. So one of the phases of your career was with Quillette. I believe you were an associate editor with Quillette.
Yeah.
And people might remember we interviewed Ione Italia, who's now an associate editor of Quillette. And Quillette is a sort of free speech platform. So I wonder if you could take us through, why did you join Quillette in the first place, and then why did you leave?
So I first became aware of Quillette, I think, in 2016. And I'd seen some of the things they'd published, and I'd reached out to Claire Lehman on Twitter, and then when I was, and I think I'd contributed something. Yeah, I had contributed something when I was cancelled in 2018, and one of the only people to reach out and offer me a job after I'd lost 5 positions and was sort of had been publicly shamed was Claire. So for a couple of years at least, I worked as an associate editor, and it was great. I mean, it was everyone worked from home. There was no office, and even if there had been, it would have been in Sydney. I mean, maybe there is an office now, but we had a couple of socials in which we got together. We had one in Toronto and another one in New Orleans. But for the most part, it was just a kind of online community. But the other editors, Jonathan Kay in particular and Jamie, were incredibly good and conscientious, and the standards were incredibly high. And one of the lessons I learned, which I took with me when I started first what was Lockdown Skeptics but became the Daily Sceptic, was to scrupulously read everything that came in over the transom, stuff which was unsolicited. So on a newspaper or a magazine, you are constantly deluged with unsolicited material from people who want to be published. And in my previous editorial jobs, I hadn't kind of methodically worked my way through those slush piles because, your chances of finding anything decent are pretty slim. But at Quillette, they were absolutely conscientious about going through everything. And, one of my jobs as a kind of junior associate editor was to go through stuff that had just come in unsolicited. And very occasionally, you do find real gems and sometimes discover, really talented writers that way. I think that's how Claire discovered Coleman Hughes when he was an undergrad at Columbia. Just sent a piece to her, completely unsolicited, and she said, "This is fantastic." Published him, and now he's become a kind of star. So it's one of the reasons I think there's so much high quality material in Quillette from so many different voices in so many different countries, is because they are scrupulous about going through everything.
And so you worked with them for a while, and it seems like you were happy to do this. And then at a certain point, you decided to step down from that role or leave?
Well, I wouldn't say there was a falling out, but we disagreed. I disagreed with all the other editors about the lockdown policy. So I, from a very early stage, was a lockdown skeptic. I thought that the lockdown policy would inevitably cause more harm than good, and was also a breach of fundamental freedoms and a completely unacceptable escalation of the state's interventions in our lives. And Claire and Jonathan and Jamie all thought the policy was wholly warranted. And they thought that, and I started publishing Lockdown Skeptics and various critics of the lockdown policy on Lockdown Skeptics, and they disapproved of some of the people I was publishing and thought they were cranks and shouldn't be participating in this kind of important kind of international public debate. I mean, I wouldn't say they were, overly censorious about it, but they thought that I had effectively gone down a rabbit hole, that I'd been led astray, and that I was behaving in a kind of scientifically illiterate way and essentially irresponsibly giving a platform to people who really had no proper credentials. They were speaking out with their field of expertise to participate in this kind of vitally important debate about how best to mitigate the impact of this, at that stage, kind of unknown virus. Anyway, so we sort of disagreed about that, not in a particularly bad-tempered way, but it became clear that because there was this profound schism, it was difficult for me to continue to work at Quillette.
Although you weren't publishing these people in Quillette.
No.
But it does strike me that if, to the extent that Quillette wants to be a free speech publication, then it should be open to those views as well. And perhaps, was that part of your thinking, that they'd shifted away from their mission a bit by kind of ruling out lockdown sceptical views?
To be fair, they did allow me to publish some lockdown critical views in Quillette and to engage in, an exchange with someone who was a defender of the lockdown policy. So that I wouldn't say they were censorious or kind of, strayed outside their commitment to free speech. It was more just kind of, we were just continuing to have the same argument. Whenever I got together with the other editors, whenever there was a kind of editorial conference, we would inevitably end up arguing. And Claire wasn't as firmly in the pro-lockdown camp as Jonathan Kay was. But he was, a lot of people back then were, they got quite impassioned when debating this issue.
They did indeed.
And in the end, I just thought it would, rather than kind of continue to have these passionate disagreements every time, we communicated, and every time I published a piece that, they thought was beyond the pale or irresponsible, it would be better just to step away.
Fair enough. There is another thing I'd like to talk to you about, which is free schools, otherwise known as academies, I think, in the UK. Now, in New Zealand, under the coalition agreement between ACT and National, we're going to be having our second round of charter schools. And this is something that's of great interest to me because I do the education work at the New Zealand Initiative, and I'm involved in the government's promise to implement a knowledge-rich curriculum. One of the things that's sort of interesting about that is that there's a little bit of a tension between those two policies, because on one hand, in the past, New Zealand has had a very loose curriculum, doesn't specify much at all in terms of knowledge. Arguably, the Minister of Education, Minister Stanford, is moving in a more centralising direction by having a much more robust curriculum. Obviously, I'm a supporter of that, or I wouldn't be working with her on it. On the other hand, charter schools are not going to be compelled to teach that curriculum. They're going to have charters which will specify outcomes that they have to produce in order to maintain their funding. Now, I know that you're also a proponent of a knowledge-rich curriculum. How do you square that circle?
Yeah, well, when I and some other people helped set up one of the first charter schools in England, the West London Free School, the national curriculum that local authority schools were forced to teach had been designed by the previous Labour government, and it was very poor. It was a skills-based rather than a knowledge-based curriculum, and poor in other respects too. And one of my motivations for wanting to start a charter school was I didn't want to teach this curriculum. I didn't want my children to be taught it. I, like you, wanted them to be taught a knowledge-rich curriculum, and was inspired by the work of E.D. Hirsch and others in developing a knowledge-rich curriculum. And so we spent a lot of time developing the curriculum at the secondary school, and then I helped set up 3 primary schools for 4 to 11-year-olds, and we developed what we now call the primary knowledge curriculum. And we actually adapted the work that Hirsch did as part of the Core Knowledge Foundation in the US. So an English think tank called Civitas tried to adapt the curriculum Hirsch and his foundation had developed for elementary schools in the US for English primary schools, and we in turn adapted the work that Civitas had done, and we now work with hundreds of other primary schools across England, helping them embed and teach our primary knowledge curriculum. But the national curriculum in the UK was changed in 2014, so a new national curriculum, which is a knowledge-based curriculum, was rolled out in 2014 in England by Michael Gove, then the Education Secretary, which was a vast improvement on the previous one. One of the freedoms that free schools and academies enjoy is that they don't have, like charter schools here, so they don't have to teach the national curriculum. I wouldn't have minded, teaching the new, improved, knowledge-based national curriculum from 2014 onwards. But we didn't switch to teaching that because we'd already developed our own version of it. But one of the threats currently looming is that the Labour Party has said that it intends to rewrite the national curriculum again, and this time they want to put oracy, which is a kind of fancy way of saying public speaking, at the centre of the new national curriculum.
I think it's worse than that. Like oracy, as it's often described in education circles, conflates oral language with literacy.
Right.
And that is the mistake behind, for example, the whole language method, the failed whole language method of learning to read, because the assumption is that children can acquire reading and writing in the same kind of way that they acquire oral language. Right. And of course they don't.
Yeah.
When children are very young, they're receptive to oral language as a biological function is a good way of thinking of it. So obviously the details of the language vary across the world depending on the one spoken around you, but a young child will acquire it apparently effortlessly, certainly without being directly taught. Whereas if reading and writing are not directly taught, they will be acquired unreliably at best.
Yes. Okay, so not a great development. And not only that, but they're going to obviously outsource the drafting of a new national curriculum to various academics, and so inevitably there'll be a kind of a decolonization agenda, and no doubt critical race theory as well as gender identity ideology will find their way into the new national curriculum. But not only is Labour going to rewrite it and undo all the good work Michael Gove did in 2014, but they say they're going to force academies and free schools to teach it. So that freedom currently enjoyed by academies and free schools, the Labour government is saying it's going to take away and force them to teach this new national curriculum. So that's a big battle ahead in the UK. One of the things I think which will make it easier to defend those freedoms here than it was under the last government in New Zealand, when Jacinda Ardern essentially destroyed the autonomy of a handful of charter schools overnight.
Well, they closed them.
And then reopened them, but without the same freedoms, just under national authority.
They became what's known as special character schools.
Right.
Special character schools have to teach the New Zealand curriculum. They're subject to the same funding model as all other schools, but they get a carve-out for a particular approach they want to take, perhaps Montessori or the like. So they're not at all like a free school or a charter school.
Right. One of the advantages we have that you didn't is that 40% of taxpayer-funded primary schools in England are academies or free schools, and 80% of secondaries. So forcing all of those schools to teach the new national curriculum is going to be quite an undertaking, and hopefully there'll be a lot of opposition that we can
quite galvanize. A lot of angry parents potentially.
Yeah, and another advantage we have is that we have now quite a lot of data. So the first free schools, academies predate free schools, but the first free schools were opened in 2011, and they've now got exam results under their belt, and the most successful schools in the country now, or in England, are free schools, and free schools that teach a knowledge-based curriculum like the Michaela Community School.
Very famous, that one.
More successful than old-style independent schools? Or?
Well, there's a measure called Progress 8, which measures how much progress children make between the ages of 11 and 16 in a kind of set of subjects relative to how a comparable group of children with the same prior attainment have performed.
The same socioeconomic.
Yeah, they try and
data as
control
well.
they try and control for socioeconomic background, prior attainment, and try and isolate just what effect the school has had on how much progress children have made in that particular school. It's not a perfect measure, but it's a pretty good measure. And by that measure, Michaela is the most successful taxpayer-funded secondary school in England. Now, independent schools don't measure progress aid. They measure progress in other ways. And, of course, when it comes to GCSE results, independent schools at the kind of top of the tree do better, but that's because they're selective. And free schools aren't. When it comes to A-level results, again, the most successful school in the country in England is a free school, the King's Maths Academy. It's just a sixth form, so it's just 16 to 19. But that actually outperforms independent schools as well as state schools. It's just the most successful school in England, full stop. And I think it'll be hard, not impossible, but hard for Labour to say, you should ditch the curriculum you're teaching and teach this new national curriculum we've devised if you can show that schools teaching the curriculum that they've devised are actually doing better than any other schools in the country. What's the argument? And particularly, at Michaela and lots of other schools which excel by teaching a knowledge-based curriculum, children from disadvantaged backgrounds do far better in those schools than they do in schools which place, oracy at the centre of the curriculum.
I mean, that oracy one troubles me greatly, as does the potential insertion of various ideology in your curriculum. They could keep the infrastructure of the knowledge-rich curricula while placing that ideology in it. Do you know what their intentions are? Are they talking about a rewrite back in the direction of a skills-based curriculum, or have they made any noise about exactly what they intend to do?
A paper has been produced by the Shadow Education Minister talking about why Labour wants to put oracy at the centre of the curriculum, and their argument is that it will help children from disadvantaged backgrounds more than the current curriculum. So the argument is that a knowledge-based curriculum isn't inclusive enough, because for children with special educational needs, children with low prior attainment, children from chaotic family backgrounds are not going to be able to access a knowledge-based curriculum as easily as they could a more skills-focused curriculum.
Right.
And they also argue, the old saw, that a curriculum which equips children with these particular skills, children will be better prepared for 21st century jobs than they would be if they're taught a kind of Gradgrindian diet of pure facts.
Yeah,
it's an argument I think we've comprehensively won in England anyway. And
yes, the idea that it needs to be Gradgrindian is very tired.
Yeah.
But putting that aside, there is, I must say, an issue with oral language that we haven't seen before in New Zealand schools. I'd be very surprised if it wasn't the case in the UK as well, which is children starting at primary school without sufficient oral language, not only to become literate, but even to understand what's going on in the classroom. So there is a real problem there. The question is what to do about it. And one could argue that the curriculum has a role, but again, we need to take seriously what oral language is and how it's different than literacy. So there may actually be a place for a degree of explicit instruction over things like vocabulary and grammar, which is usually in the form of correction. But to me, the most important thing is to ensure that primary school classrooms are rich oral language environments. And here is where Lev Vygotsky's zone of proximal development is a useful idea. We should be speaking to children just a little bit ahead of where they are themselves, so never speaking down to them, never using kiddie language or anything like that, but actually extending their vocabulary in a way that they can reach for, not so far ahead that they can't follow. So arguably curriculum does have a role in fixing that problem, which
Yeah.
I think is probably largely attributable to toddlers being given screens too much, or their parents being on screens too much.
Yeah, I think that's probably an optimistic reading of what the Labour government has in mind by putting oracy at the centre of the national curriculum. I think it's more likely to be a kind of resiling on the current commitment to teach phonics to
Right.
children in.
Well, that would be a tragedy.
Yeah, you're right. It's kind of it's the problem facing British schools is that lots of children that were taken out of school during the lockdowns have not returned to school. And, the overwhelming majority of them are from disadvantaged backgrounds.
We have the same, yeah.
And that's the issue that Labour should be, grasping, and an issue that hasn't been sufficiently dealt with by the outgoing Conservative government. I mean, but then they're not seemingly not proposing to do anything about that. They're just going to tinker with the curriculum.
Perhaps as a final question, and this is a big one, what do you think the prospects are for liberal democracy over the coming decade, 2 decades? It seems that everywhere it's in decline or under assault, whether it's on speech rights or kind of more polarised radical politics. Certainly, I mean, one of the things that seems to be a hallmark of or a presumptive hallmark of the UK election forthcoming is Nigel Farage's party potentially even eclipsing the Tories, the Liberal Democrats doing well. Now, they've been around a long time and no one would call them radical, but there does seem to be a fracturing of the electorate in a way that we haven't seen before. It's playing out across Europe with the rise of populist parties. New Zealand has a little bit of a safety valve on it with its MMP system, so we get a lot of parties in Parliament and they have to cobble together coalitions. And again, the American election coming up at the end of the year looks like another bruising affair with perhaps Trump likely to win again and the inevitable ructions that would follow such a victory. How do you see things in terms of the prospects for democracy?
Yeah, well, I'd say I'm reasonably gloomy, but not suicidally so. I mean, the problem in the UK, which is been brought into sharp relief by the general election campaign, is the same problem besetting liberal democracy elsewhere, which is that there doesn't seem to be a coherent, charismatic, alternative ideology to the dominant ideologies in liberal democracy. So you've got the kind of woke mind virus, which is probably the ideology of the ruling class in most Western liberal democracies. And then you've got a kind of competing Islamist ideology, which is becoming increasingly powerful and charismatic in the UK, particularly in Muslim-majority areas, places like London. It's not a Muslim-majority area, but there are plenty of Muslims there. And there are these demonstrations every Saturday involving hundreds of thousands of people.
Northern cities as well, right?
In other cities in the country, yeah. And then you've got the kind of seemingly the only right of centre, or the only successful right of centre alternative to those ideologies is a kind of bloodless technocratic managerialism. I guess, what you're experiencing now with your coalition government, your Prime Minister. So into this vacuum has emerged a kind of right-wing populist kind of insurgency. And we saw the success of various right-wing populist parties in the European elections a couple of weeks ago. Looks likely, not inevitable, but likely that Trump will win the US presidential election. Reform, as you say, which is our version, I don't know, the National Assembly or the National Rally in France, is surging in the polls and might yet eclipse the Conservatives. And the Conservatives very much embody this kind of bloodless, technocratic, managerialist approach as well. And I suppose, I'm concerned that, let's suppose the National Rally wins a majority in the French parliamentary elections. Will they actually have a coherent programme of government? It feels quite like just a kind of, a counter-revolutionary response to radical progressive ideology without having much kind of depth of thought or having put much thought into kind of policies. Is France going to leave the European Union? What becomes of Europe in the absence of the European Union? To what extent will that render European countries susceptible to Chinese, Russian hostility and so on and so forth? I mean, it feels like we're on the kind of cusp of quite a kind of perilous period in history. And even though my sympathies are drawn to, the populist insurgents, the counter-revolutionaries, I do worry that they don't really have a well-thought-through kind of coherent kind of policy agenda. I mean, I think the fundamental problem is that liberal democracy is much less stable than I think we thought when it triumphed.
I agree.
In the aftermath of the Cold War. And I've just read a really interesting book called The Demon in Democracy by a Polish political scientist who essentially talks about the extraordinary similarities between liberal democracy and the kind of communist control systems that it replaced across Eastern Central Europe. And there is a kind of totalitarian strain, which is what he refers to as the demon in liberal democracy. And, it used to be that, liberal democracy created a kind of framework within which different people could pursue their own conception of the good. And various rules were in place which were neutral with respect to different conceptions of the good. And one of those rules was, a belief in free speech. But the acceptable conceptions of the good within that framework have become much, much narrower. And that's, I think, one of the reasons for the assault on free speech. The ruling elites in the chancelleries of Europe, they think that when it comes to what a good life looks like, what a good society looks like, that issue is settled, and that they've arrived at the correct conclusion, and they're full of kind of moral righteousness about how correct their particular conception of a good society is. And anyone challenging that finds it very difficult to kind of enjoy the kind of rights that they would typically have enjoyed in a liberal democracy up until about 15 years ago. It's as though, the justification for free speech, which was that people should be allowed to pursue and develop these different conceptions of the good in their own way, and that the role of the state is to kind of be the kind of referee, the keeper, the guarantor of a kind of neutral framework within certain boundaries. It's as though that's largely been abandoned, or at least the kind of the different conceptions of the good that it's permissible to pursue has become kind of far narrower than it was, and that's partly what's prompted the kind of populist insurgency.
It's not only narrower, but as you say, it's as if these elites have grabbed control of what was the neutral umpire and are steering it in a direction of partisanship.
Yes. I mean, I think they don't see it that way, and it's always hard to kind of work out whether they're just kind of wrapping their authoritarian kind of interventions in a kind of rhetorical smokescreen, or whether they genuinely believe that they have to suspend democratic norms in order to preserve democracy. I mean, there is, as far as people like Donald Tusk, and Ursula von der Leyen are concerned, the reason they have to, cleanse social media of misinformation and disinformation and hate speech is because they think that Europe is on the cusp of seeing a resurgence of fascism, and that poses a far greater threat to the health and vitality of liberal democracy than their own interventions to kind of ward off that demon.
Well, we got versions of that argument here too, the one about we have to cut down on hate speech because people being allowed to say offensive things actually reduces other people's ability to speak.
Yes.
That's another big one.
It's kind of the way priesthoods have always been, isn't it? They're motivated by virtue. It can lead them into some fairly scary.
Yes, I mean, I think the answer to that puzzle as to how self-aware they are is that clever people are very good at persuading themselves that acting in their own self-interest is the kind of morally correct thing to do. They rationalize what is ultimately self-interested behavior. And what you see are these kind of beleaguered liberal elites, not just in Europe, but across the English-speaking world, persuading themselves, convincing themselves that they have to make these various illiberal interventions and resile from their commitment to free speech and parliamentary democracy in order to preserve our democratic way of life, our liberal way of life.
And that's exactly why I would say free speech must be protected in order to challenge that and hopefully bring about a bit more self-reflection. So, look, thank you so much for joining us today, Toby Young. It's been a fascinating conversation indeed.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much.